Good morning, my dear students. I'm here to talk to you today about paper 213. The fourth semester students, I'm sure you know that this paper is called Literary Criticism. What is criticism is a question you may well ask. Any reading, any study, any look at something that has already been created. So you might hear and listen to art critics, film critics, book critics. Of course, we are talking about literary criticism. Paper number 213. And if you look at your syllabus, you will see that this is the second topic, which means you already know a little bit about Plato. I'm going to talk about Aristotle. Who was Aristotle? We know him for different reasons. Look at the slide and you will see the dates. Isn't it interesting that the date is 384 BC to 322 BC? Interesting? Yes, and probably a little confusing. But remember, in this period, that is BC, we go from the bigger to the smaller because we have to reach 0 BC and then begin with 1 AD. So Aristotle lived from 384 BC to 322 BC. Where did he live? Who was he? How else do we know him? Well, he lived in Greece. He was the disciple of Plato. The disciple of Plato. Who was Plato? You can't ask me because you already know that Plato too was a great literary critic. These were philosophers. They talked about various topics, unlike you and me who specialize in the 21st century in only one subject. They talked about a number of subjects. Let me tell you about Aristotle. He gathered around him a number of pupils and talked to them like the great Socrates, the great Plato. And today, when we look at Aristotle as a critic, what is it of his writings that have come down to us? Two major books, Poetics and Rhetoric. Poetics is a book with which we are concerned at the moment because in this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about tragedy. Look at the slide, and I'm trying to tell you what this Poetics is all about. Why should we know what Poetics is? Well, Poetics is a book. Did Aristotle write the book? Well, we don't know. Maybe some of his students got together, collected his lectures, and gave it a book form. It's only about 56 pages and deals with a variety of topics. Sometimes we wonder why this book does not contain some of the important topics which we talk about when we think of Aristotle as a critic. There is no mention of catharsis in the Poetics that has come down to us, but we know that catharsis is an important part of Aristotle's contribution. Do you remember Alexander the Great, the one who came from Europe, passed Africa, and reached Asia? And by the age of 26, he had conquered parts of 3 different continents. Well, Aristotle was at the court of Alexander's father, King Philip, and he is considered to have been a tutor to Alexander. Well, the importance of the Poetics is all that we know about literature from Aristotle comes to us in this book called Poetics. So this is his most important work. The other book, of course, is Rhetoric, but that you would deal with, you would look at if you were interested in speech, in the spoken part, because remember, my dear students, there were no books then. So whatever had to go from one person to another had to be through speech, oral traditions, and therefore the rhetoric is also very important. So what do we have in the Poetics? We have all the points that I'm going to talk to you about today. The plan of the Poetics, as I told you, running into 56 pages and about 20 chapters, where he talks about the different aspects of literature, which we will talk about today. I am interested in talking to you today about tragedy. To this date, more than 2000 years later, when we think of tragedy, we still think of the definition that Aristotle gave us. And what was this definition? Look at the slide carefully and seriously. Tragedy, according to Aristotle, is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not narrative, through pity and fear, effecting the purgation of these emotions. My dear students, this is very important. For this topic, Aristotle's definition of tragedy is the point that we are going to be discussing for the entire session. So, what is it? Number one, it is an imitation. An imitation of what? An imitation of an action. How should the action be? The action should be serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. You understand, serious, it cannot be comic. It should be complete. Therefore, at the end of the tragedy, you should feel that the story is complete, that the events are complete, that there are no loose threads left hanging. And more importantly, it should be of a certain magnitude. That is, it must have a certain height. It must have a certain depth. What about the language? The language should be embellished, decorated, ornamented with what? With each kind of artistic ornament. Later in the paper 213, you're going to be talking about figures of speech. That is what we mean by artistic ornament. The several kinds being found in separate parts of the play. Remember, my dear students, tragedy is a kind of drama. The other kinds, are comedy, farce, tragicomedy, etc. But here we are talking about tragedy. And so, in different parts of the play, the dramatist, the writer, according to Aristotle, should be using different kinds of ornamentation, different kinds of figures of speech, different figures of speech about which you already know a little bit in your first sem and second sem and in your third sem. But in your fourth sem, in this paper, you'll be looking at it in greater detail. But that would be another lecture. But in this lecture, enough to say that different parts of the tragedy need different kinds of ornamentation. So, the several kinds being found in several parts of the play, in the form of action, not narrative. What is the difference between drama and fiction, between a novel and a play? Of course, you know that in a novel there is narration, whereas in a play there is action. Get that clear, my dear students, that in a tragedy you have to have action and not narration. You understand the difference because the novelist describes, whereas the dramatist is absent. Whatever he wants to say is shown on the stage, or maybe when you read it through action. And therefore, narration is not important, action is important. And then, what is the aim? What is the goal? The purgation of pity and fear. I shall be talking about it more when I talk to you about catharsis. The purgation of pity and fear. When we have some infection in the body, you take a medicine so that you're purged, so that you're cleaned. Well, after you watch a tragedy, according to Aristotle, the emotions of pity and fear are purged. So shall we look at the important words of this definition? Imitation, action, language, artistic ornament, action, not narration, effecting purgation. If you are taking down notes, I would say that you should quickly jot down these points, because if you remember these points, you will be able to understand what Aristotle meant by tragedy. What is it that he tried to define in his concept of tragedy? And when I say his concept, my dear students, I want you to remember that even after 2000 years, we still think that this is one of the best definitions that we have of tragedy. And I want you to remember that he was a Greek philosopher, and therefore it is in Greek, in the Greek language, that he spoke. But it has come down to us after these 2000 odd years, and we still believe that that definition is a fantastic definition. Some scenes for you. Just to give you an idea, what is it that we mean by tragedy? Generally, when you think of tragedy, you think of large-scale killing, large-scale destruction, devastation. So this is the kind of picture that comes to your mind when you think of a large-scale tragedy. But remember, when Aristotle is defining tragedy, it is not only the tragedy of war that he is talking about. Think of all the great tragedies of Greece and Rome. Think of Oedipus. Think of the great tragedies of the Elizabethan age. Think of Hamlet and Macbeth and King Lear and Othello and Romeo and Juliet. The tragedy was not caused by war. But I just brought this slide to show you that this also is a kind of tragedy. So now, let me go back to Aristotle's definition and tell you something about the characteristics of tragedy, the origin of tragedy. What were the earliest tragedies that we have? I just mentioned a couple from Greece and Rome. So the earliest written tragedy probably that we think of is what we think of when we think of Oedipus. You must also remember that when we are talking about tragedy, we have to compare it. We have to understand the difference between, say, tragedy and comedy. Aristotle was very clear that comedy is far inferior to tragedy. He placed tragedy very high. In fact, at some stage, he even thought that it was greater than the epic, because according to him, imitation of an action more than narration, is far more difficult. So he talked about tragedy and comedy, and he explained to us how a comedy is inferior to tragedy for various reasons. When I talk about the tragic hero, I'll draw your attention to it again. But even the characters of a tragedy have to be superior. When he says superior, he says that they should be of a certain stature, of a certain respectability maybe, by which the tragedy caused to them is not only their tragedy. It's like the falling of a great oak tree. See, when the oak tree, maybe you've not seen an oak tree, but you can think of a banyan tree, or you can think of a peepal tree. When the tree falls, it crushes all the smaller plants, all the vegetation around it. According to Aristotle, tragedy should have a character or characters of that stature, so that when they fall, it is not they alone who fall. The second point that we have to remember when we talk about Aristotle's concept of tragedy are the two emotions that he talks about. One is pity, the other is fear. When you watch a tragedy, think of any tragedy, my dear students. Maybe no great literary tragedies come to mind, but think of a film, Hindi, English, Gujarati. Think of a serial maybe which is tragic. And what comes to your mind? That when you see the character suffering, you probably pity the character. Oh, poor fellow, or poor female, poor character, poor woman, poor child, poor man. You pity. Yes, but at the same time, within you arises the emotion of fear. Why fear? Well, if it could happen to Hamlet, it could happen to me. If it could happen to King Lear, it could happen to me. Think of any of your characters. We don't have much of tragedy in Sanskrit drama, but you could think of maybe a very well-known Sanskrit play and think of Abhigya and Shakuntal and say, well, if it could happen to Shakuntal, if Dushyant could forget her, well, it could happen to me too. So what happens? You are filled with a sense of fear when you watch a tragedy. What does Aristotle want a tragedy to do? What is the aim of tragedy? What is the effect of tragedy? What is the advantage of watching a tragedy? According to him, the watcher, the spectator, the audience, or in case you read a tragedy, that is the reader or the viewer. What happens to him? He's purged, he's cleansed, he's cleaned. The feelings of pity and fear are removed from him, and he comes out a better person. Why and how? Because he learns from the tragedy. Maybe tragedy is entertainment. Maybe you see a play, you see a movie for the pleasure. But according to Aristotle, when you come out after seeing a play or reading a play, a tragedy, you are purged of these emotions. And therefore you realize the fear tells you not to act in a similar way. Let me talk about Hamlet, because what happens is Hamlet postpones. He does not act. Procrastination. And therefore, the viewer, the reader realizes that postponing, procrastination is bad. Aaj Kal kare to aaj kar. You must learn that don't postpone anything to tomorrow. And fear, the fear that it might happen to me. What does it make the character do? Not act in a similar way. You understand the point? So what is the effect of tragedy? What is the goal of tragedy? What is the advantage of reading and watching a tragedy? Pity and fear, the purging of these two emotions. So pity and fear are purged. Remember, when we were talking about the definition, I told you think of some words, keywords, and there I talked about an action that is serious and complete. In a comedy, you could have light-hearted action. You could have somebody slipping and falling. You could have a very fat person walking with a very thin person, and this could cause comedy. You could have comedy by punning. You could have comedy in language. You could have comedy in action. You could have comedy probably in presupposition or in imagination. But what happens when you watch a tragedy? The action has to be serious. What is serious? Remember, if I'm thinking of Macbeth, I shall give you examples from literature which you are more likely to read than to go back to Oedipus. Though for Aristotle, probably Oedipus would be the best example. But for my dear students, I think maybe Shakespeare would be better. Because even if you don't do the plays of Shakespeare, I'm sure you have some idea about the story, about what happens, about the events, about the main characters. So many of my examples today in this lecture will be from Shakespeare. So when I say serious, what is the seriousness? Macbeth kills his cousin and king. King Lear is thrown out by his own daughters, two of them who are very bad. Hamlet's father has been killed by his own uncle. Othello is troubled by jealousy. All these are leading to, are a result of, or are a cause of great tragedy. And therefore, we say the action has to be serious. Look at each one of these plays. At the end of the play, if I have to talk to you about Hamlet, the action is complete. You know that all the villains have been got rid of. Claudius, Polonius, they are dead. Laertes is not a villain. He was a good friend of Hamlet and the brother of Ophelia to whom Hamlet was engaged. Anyway, so I'm talking about the action being complete. So what do I mean when I say the action is complete? At the end of the story, you know that good has won over evil. You know that there is poetic justice. No tragedy should leave you troubled, not knowing what will happen. You probably know what should have happened, but you don't know what will happen because the tragedy, Aristotle does not agree that any tragedy should end on an incomplete note. And therefore, he talks about serious and complete. The next point that I want to highlight for you, my dear students, is the concept of organic unity. You understand, when you watch a play, when you watch a movie, or you watch a serial, or you read a novel, very often, too many characters, too many events, you don't even know why the characters have come in. You don't even know why the characters have been introduced. You don't know what's going to happen to the characters. And you keep wondering, why did this person come in or go out? What did he have to do with the basic story? What is happening to the protagonist, to the main character? We don't understand. And you are left bewildered. You are left troubled, worried. Aristotle says a good tragedy cannot afford to do that. It should have unity. What do we mean by unity? Unity of action, unity of place, unity of time. He talks about all this. Action, he does not believe in the concept of subplots. You know, in some of our plays, in some of our movies, you've seen that there are many characters. If something is happening to the hero and heroine, at a lower level, it's happening to a friend, or it's happening to somebody else in the family, or to somebody in the neighborhood, or to somebody in the next city. So what is happening? Two plots are going simultaneously. Aristotle is against this. He says there should be organic unity. That is, there should be one plot, and everything that's happening in that tragedy should be related to that plot. Unity of plot, unity of action. Please remember, I'm not saying that Aristotle said there should be only 2 characters or there should be only 4 characters. He didn't give us the number of characters. all that he said is, if you have a plot, make sure that all the action in that tragedy revolves around that plot, or in some way or the other related to that plot. Shakespeare did not believe in this, my dear students. Any play of Shakespeare that you read, you would notice another plot, a subplot simultaneously taking place. But to Aristotle, organic unity was important. For a minute, I would like to talk to you. I talked to you about tragedy and comedy. I'll talk to you about tragedy and epic too, because Aristotle has made a comparison, not in his definition of tragedy, but in his description of the characteristics. To him, epic is important because epic deals on a large scale. But somewhere, Aristotle feels that tragedy is higher than epic. And the reason he gives is that whatever you see is always better than what you read. And you know, my dear students, tragedy is meant to be enacted on the stage. It's a play, drama, which means you see it. So there is a dramatic element in tragedy which the epic lacks, according to Aristotle. Not all critics agree with that. There are many critics who place the epic far above the tragedy, but not Aristotle. To him, the epic lacks the spectacle that one can see in the tragedy. Epic is on a much larger scale, but in his definition, in his understanding, in his review of literature, in his critical approach, he believes that the tragedy is the highest form of literature. You know the word genre, right? Literary form. So if he's talking about the various literary forms, he certainly places tragedy at number one. A quick look at the characteristics, my dear students. Once again, remember that we are talking about the difference between tragedy and comedy, between tragedy and epic. We are talking about the necessity of unity of action or organic unity in a plot. We are talking about seriousness. We are talking about completeness. We are talking about magnitude. And of course, we are talking about the aim, the advantage of watching a tragedy, the aim, the goal of writing a tragedy. And according to Aristotle, it is purgation. It is catharsis, which is the Greek word, and which means purgation. Understand the word purgation very simply as cleaning, as cleansing. Cleansing of what? Cleansing of the two emotions of pity and fear. So that after reading any tragedy, after watching any tragedy, you come out a better human being. Let's go on with Aristotle's views on tragedy. What are the main parts, the constituent parts of a tragedy? My dear students, Aristotle lists for us 6. I've been talking to you in general about all of them, about each one of them in different ways. Remember, even when we looked at the original definition, I did mention to you in passing. But now it's time for us to look at each one of them in more detail. Plot, character, thought, diction, song, spectacle. There are 6 parts, you understand, constituent parts. That means the 6 together, put together, form what is a tragedy. Please remember, Aristotle does not say that one follows the other. They are all there in a tragedy. Think of any dish, think of a cup of tea. And if I say milk, water, tea and sugar, it does not mean that they are placed one after the other. Together, they give you your cup of tea. In the same way, what is tragedy? What is it that tragedy should have? Let's look at each one of them. I've talked about it, but I'm going to repeat some of it, and some of it will be new. The first is plot. Remember, we talked about plot not having subplots. We talked about organic unity. We talked about unity of action. Let me introduce 2 more words, simple and complex plots. To Aristotle, a good play should have a complex plot, because a plot, the play, the tragedy, should make you think. It should not be linear and just give you one idea. Let me again go back to any of Shakespeare's plays, and you notice how many ideas come into it. Can you have a play without character, my dear students? Obviously you cannot. You certainly have a hero. We call him a tragic hero. I'll talk about that later. But you need character. You need thought. When you use the word thought, remember, we talk about theme. Remember theme, remember plot. You've heard these words already in Sem 1. So you need a thought. What is it that is important to me in the writing of this play is probably what the dramatist asks himself. What is it that I want to write about? What is my major? And this could be very often a flaw, a defect in the character, in the main character, in the tragic hero, which leads to tragedy. Let me say that again. Remember, I told you Hamlet could not act. He postponed, and therefore procrastination. For Othello, it was jealousy. Unfortunately, in Greek tragedy, very often the tragic events are not caused by any flaw or defect in the character, in the tragic hero. Instead, they are caused by fate. The character is born under a certain sign, under the influence of a bad planet. And what happens? He has to pay the price. That makes the tragedy much more tragic, because whatever he does, he cannot get out of that. You know, what we call Nasib, what we call Kundali, what we call Lakheluche. This is what Greek tragedy believed in. The character cannot do anything, and therefore he is bound to suffer, as happens in the case of Oedipus. To my mind, one of the greatest tragedies ever written, because Oedipus is so helpless against what the planets conspire for him. You know, something like the characters of Thomas Hardy, where fate plays a major role in the events of the novels of Hardy. So also in a Greek tragedy, the character suffers because fate has conspired, like the gods conspiring, like wanton flies, like flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, says Shakespeare. Therefore, we cannot do anything when fate conspires against us. But that, my dear students, is Greek tragedy, not the Elizabethan tragedy, not a lot of later tragedy that we come to see. But I just want to highlight here the point of thought. What is the theme that the dramatist has thought about in the writing of this play? That's important. And then we come to diction. What is diction? Diction is language. You know the word dictionary? What is a dictionary? It is a collection of words with meanings, with usage, with the pronunciation, etc. But how does the word come? From the word diction. And what does the word diction mean? It means language. I think somewhere in your study of Wordsworth or Coleridge or the Romantic tradition, you might have heard of the phrase poetic diction, the language of poetry. So Aristotle talks about diction. And remember, when I talked to you about diction earlier, I talked about the ornamentation. You need ornaments to look beautiful, right? You use jewelry. So also does the writer use figures of speech in order to make his writing more beautiful. And therefore, in diction, we also introduce not just words, not just the arrangement of words, but what is it that a writer does in order to beautify the language. Remember, the metaphor and simile to Aristotle were very important. There are, of course, other figures of speech, but I think you could easily understand how you use the simile or the metaphor, even in everyday language, to make your language more effective. Well, if you do it in everyday language, why should not writers do? To have a better effect, to have emphasis, to make a greater impression on the reader or the audience. So, when we talk about diction, we mean words, we mean the choice of words, we mean the arrangement of words, we mean the figures of speech, we mean all that put together which contributes to the overall literary, artistic, aesthetic effect of the play, of the tragedy. The next point that he talks about is song. When you think of Hindi movies, I don't think you can think of a single movie without a song. There may be one or two exceptions, but all of us, we remember many of our movies because of our songs. You may be surprised, or maybe you do know, that in European drama, song played a very important role. Song conveyed the inner feelings, the emotions of the characters. The song was used not merely as an ornament, but to take you deeper, further into the characters' thoughts or into the action. Think of many of the plays of Shakespeare where you have songs. And Aristotle also gave great importance to song. The last constituent that we have to look at is spectacle. You know the word spectacle, and when I use the word spectacle, my dear students, you're probably thinking of spectacles, which many of your teachers probably wear, which I'm wearing now. But when I use the word spectacle, I'm not talking about that spectacle. Specs, I'm not talking about spectacles, I'm talking about spectacle. It's singular, there's no S, and you cannot shorten it into spec. Please understand that there's a major difference between what you call spectacles and what Aristotle means when he uses the word spectacle, and which we use even today when we use it in the adjective form of spectacular. You talk about a spectacular event or victory, something that just puts you in awe. It could be great armies probably. It could be a ghost. It could be some great celebration. It could be, remember, there was no electricity, so I can't talk about lighting. There were no computers, so I can't talk about graphics. My dear students, in order to understand Aristotle, you have to go back to the world in which he lived. And when I talk about the world in which he lived, remember, I'm talking of a world where there were no books even. There was no writing as we know it. There was no printing press. There was no electricity. There was no microphone. And yet he talks about tragedy and he talks about spectacle. It is the stage props that they would have brought in. Anything to make it, let's say if it's a forest scene, to look like a forest. Anything to make it look like a palace. Maybe they brought in a lot of decoration. You would have to use your imagination, or probably look at some old books on drama, or go into some of the websites where you will get pictures of what the theatre, what the stage looked like then. But to Aristotle, that was an important part, an important constituent of tragedy. So a quick look at the 6 constituent parts of a tragedy. Look at your slide again, my dear students. And what do we see? Plot, character, thought, diction, song, spectacle. These 6 put together, again I repeat, not in one order, but put together, mixed together, makes a khichdi probably, but then the khichdi must have your rice and dal and salt and turmeric and etc., etc. So also a tragedy must have all these parts. Please remember, this is important for you, for a general question, for an MCQ, the 6 constituent parts. What about the structure of the plot? I've already talked to you about simple plot and complex plot. What happens, when you think of something, there has to be a growth. I talked about organic unity. What do I mean by that? That everything should be put together and you should not feel, oh, this has got nothing to do with the rest of the tragedy. So also, when you look at the structure of the plot, you can think of the structure of a building to understand what I'm saying. So what should there be? There should be a complication. That means there should be something is causing the tragedy. What tragedy do you know very well? I'll give you the example of Hamlet, or maybe I could give you the example again of Shakuntal to tell you what I mean. So what do we need to do? When I say this, what I'm talking about is the complication. What is the complication? Let's take Hamlet for example. The father has told him that you must take revenge on the person who killed me. Hamlet knows that he has to think about his uncle Claudius, his chacha, father's younger brother. And even more strangely or tragically, that chacha, Claudius, is now married to his mother, Gertrude. So how can he take revenge? on once uncle and now father, as he says. That is the complication. But you cannot take a play to the complication and leave it there. You have to bring it to the denouement. French word, and therefore a funny sort of a pronunciation, but my dear students, do write down the spelling and maybe remember it as denouement. But then the correct pronunciation is denouement, because it's a French word and it is pronounced that way. English is a funny language, I agree, but when we take words from other languages, sometimes English language retains that, and then that makes it more difficult for us. The unraveling, what happens at the end? That is the denouement. You know, it's like tying the threads together. I told you, you cannot have any loose threads hanging. You cannot have any loose threads here, and we have to come to the end. How do we come to the end? By the denouement, by the unraveling. So we know exactly who has done what should be done. The play started with something. Has the play ended where it should? Have all the actions that are required to be taken, have they been done? Has Hamlet been able to follow his father's advice, his father's wish, his father's order, whatever you call it? And remember, his father was already dead when the play began. So we see him as a ghost. So the ghost tells Hamlet what to do. And does Hamlet succeed in doing it, is what we have to ask. And that is the denouement. So you have the structure of the plot where there's a complication and there is a denouement. Whether it is a simple plot or a complex plot, in both you would have a complication and a denouement. How it happens might be different, but it happens. So remember, it's not whether it is complex or simple which determines whether there should be a complication and a denouement or not. Any kind of tragedy should have both a complication and a denouement. So you understand? If you want to call it as rising action, so till the complication, it is towards rising action. And then denouement is the falling action. That means you come back to level ground, right? Once again, you have to come back. Hamlet is dead. Hamlet has to be buried. Fortinbras comes there, etc., etc. at the end of Hamlet. If you think of Shakuntala as another example, Shakuntala goes back. She is recognized. Dushyant comes to take her. She has a son Bharata, and like the fairy tale, and they lived happily ever after. But you must have that denouement, you must have that unraveling in order that a play be considered a good play, a tragedy. Look at your slide, my dear students. I'm now talking to you about a tragic hero. We talk about hero, and you know, you've already done that in your Sem 1. We talk about a protagonist. A protagonist is the main character, and the character who is placed exactly against him, who is in competition, who is a rival, or who is the other part, in the sense that the protagonist is good, so the antagonist is bad. You need a protagonist and an antagonist. The original word that we used was hero. Even today, when we mean hero, he need not be a hero in the sense that he need not be fully good. But the tragic hero too, according to Aristotle, need not be so good that we consider him to be unbelievable. If there is a character who we feel is so unlike us, if we feel that we do not know any such character, if we feel that such a person cannot possibly exist, then Aristotle feels that we cannot understand, we cannot sympathize, we cannot empathize with that character. So how should the character be? What are the qualities that he should have? Let me say that again. There must be something in him which leads to his downfall. Very often it could be hubris, Hubris, my dear students, which is pride. And Aristotle believed, and later critics also believed, that one of the reasons for the fall of a tragic hero is his pride. Pride in what? Pride in being intelligent, pride in being rich, pride in being good. It could be anything. But very often it is that pride which leads to his fall. So, the character should have qualities which make him reasonably good. He cannot be bad, because if he's bad, we won't sympathize with him. If he's very good, we'll think he's unbelievable. We cannot have any such character, and so we say, oh, what happens to him cannot happen to me. So therefore, I do not sympathize, I do not understand, I do not enjoy this tragedy. So let him be a character who has certain human frailties. He's not a bad man, remember, my dear students. He's a good man, reasonably good, but he's not a perfect man. He's not so unique that you feel you've never seen anyone like him. And remember, as I told you earlier, he must be of a certain stature. If you look at the tragedies, both Greek as well as Elizabethan tragedy, you would notice that most of those tragic heroes are either kings or princes or admirals or noblemen, people at the court, because, as I said earlier, they are like great oaks, because when the oak falls, it crushes everything around them. When a grass falls, it falls, but it does not cause great damage. It does not change the lives of many hundreds of thousands of people. You can think of any great person that you know, how his death affects so many people. It could be a great politician, it could be a great leader, it could be a great army general, but think of all the great people that you know, that you've read about. And when I say know, it does not mean personally know, but people you know about. So remember, he must have qualities which are believable. I talked to you about the protagonist and the antagonist, so you can see that. What is the cause for his downfall, my dear students? It, in Greek tragedy, used to be fate, but in a lot of Elizabethan tragedy and later tragedy, it is usually a defect, a flaw. And therefore, I repeat, according to Aristotle, it could be hubris, if you pronounce the S, Hubris, it means pride. And to Aristotle, this was one of the most unforgivable defects, flaws, vice because it's the opposite of virtue, which a tragic character suffers from. And therefore, when you think of a tragic hero, remember, you place him in opposition to the antagonist, remember his qualities, remember the causes for his downfall, and you have a perfect definition, a perfect description of what a tragic hero is like, of what a tragic hero should be like. Some scenes for you, from modern films probably, but about what tragic heroes generally give you the impression. These are not from Greek tragedy, my dear friends. My dear students, this is just to give you an idea what comes to your mind when you think of a tragic hero. A tragic hero is someone who has certain qualities. What is it that we have looked at today? Can you quickly try and recollect what I've been talking to you for the last 40-50 minutes? What have I been talking to you about? I've been talking to you about the definition of tragedy. I'm going to say a number of things again, my dear students, so that you very quickly jot down whatever you think is important. Students, remember, in any lecture that you listen to, running notes are very important. And what is a running note? Notes that you take down as the lecture is going on. Notes that you take down. Because remember, you take down, you jot down. I'm sure all of you are sitting in your classrooms with some paper and some writing material, a pen or a ball pen or a pencil or anything, but you're jotting down points. Can I quickly give you a revision so that you jot down what you want to? So where did we begin? We began by talking about Aristotle. Whose disciple was Aristotle? Can I quickly ask you, and can you try to recollect? Whose disciple was Aristotle? Aristotle was the disciple of the great philosopher Plato. Whose tutor was he? Whose guru was he? Well, he was the guru of Alexander the Great, who we remember as a great conqueror even before he died at the age of 26. He was so young, but he had already conquered parts of 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And then we moved on to his definition of tragedy. What was his definition of tragedy, my dear students? What are the important points that you should remember? Remember that it should be serious, it should be an imitation of an action, it should be serious, it should have certain magnitude, It should have language which is embellished differently in different parts, right? All these is what we talked about. And of course, he ends the definition by telling you that there should be purgation of two emotions. He talks about pity and fear, effecting the purgation of these two. And remember, so when you read a tragedy, when you come out after watching a tragedy, you are cleansed. You are cleansed of two feelings which are very bad, and one is pity and one is fear. So you come out as a better person. And then I went on to talk about how Aristotle places the tragedy far above other forms, other literary genres. Genre, again, my dear students, is pronounced that way because it's a French word. And what is genre? How do you spell it? G-E-N-R-E. G-E-N-R-E. But genre, it means a literary form. So he compares it to the epic, he compares it to the comedy, and he tells us that it is far superior. We went on to look at the constituent parts, the 6 constituent parts, and you'd quickly remember what they are: plot, character, thought, diction, song, spectacle. We looked at that. I talked to you about each one of them. And then we went on to look at the tragic hero and what are his qualities. In this lecture, what we have attempted to do is to give you Aristotle's definition of tragedy, an important part of the paper 213, which is literary criticism. This is probably your second lecture, and we will go on to talking about Aristotle in another lecture where we'll talk about Aristotle's views on other aspects of literature.